but not because of that. I was like, this hurts good. She's from the communications department. She has an MPA here from the University of Washington. She's an instructor in the Department of Communications, and then I noticed a clinical instructor, no less, in the Department of Global Health. So she can very well merge technology with the field of medicine. So she's gonna, I think this will be the most entertaining lecture we've had. So, not to set you up, but.
Thank you. I wish I had named it Giving Awesome Presentations. That's going to be what I do from now on. So thank you, Amy, thank you, Peter, so much for having me here. As I was coming over on the bus, and I was thinking about the fact that I'm a passionate reader of The New Yorker, and I feel like my days are spent eating, sleeping, and trying to catch up with my subscription, which comes weekly for those of you that read The New Yorker. And there was an excellent article on Elmhurst Hospital. I don't know how many of you, did anyone see this? It was about Dr. Joseph Lieber. And as I was coming over here, I realized that in speaking to residents, you were all probably going to be spectacularly underslept after reading that article. And so I'm hoping that I can take the next 30 minutes and provide some insights, but also engage you guys in what it takes to provide persuasive presentations. And I've also been told that this will be something that you get to put into practice soon. And this guest we have coming over from the University of Pennsylvania, I'm originally from Philadelphia. I've heard she packs quite a punch. So today what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what I have seen over time as contributing to a presentation that is memorable, a presentation that is meaty, that holds good, strong information, but also really take what Jay Condra, who is he's a leadership author and someone who looks at 21st century organizations and really specifically at what persuasive communication means. Because I think when we talk about presentations that stick, we're really talking about persuasive communication. And as Amy said, I teach up at the Master of Communication and Digital Media, and I start with this slide because we live in a very noisy age. We do. We're connected by many forms of technology. We are constantly receiving information, whether it's on the job, whether it's in our home. And so I think that the skills that go into performing for 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 50 minutes in front of a crowd are more important than ever before, because the whole time we walk on this earth, we are consistently being fed information. So why not take some time to think strategically and intentionally around how you're going to use your time when you're up in front of a crowd. In the last half an hour before I came back in here, we were also talking about how, in this country at least, there's been some ebbing over time at the secondary school level around presenting in front of people. I remember when I was in third grade, we were memorizing poems. We were going up in front of the class and speaking from a very young age in front of our peers. And I now have graduate students who are terrified of public speaking. I've also found over time that when I go to weddings, toasts are on the decline. Do you guys notice that? I have a friend whose maid of honor doesn't even want to give a toast at her wedding because she's so terrified. And I actually think this is really sad, because for me, public speaking is an opportunity to tell stories. It goes back to the oldest form of entertainment that we have, around a hearth. And so I would like to invite all of you to think about, in this noisy digital age, that public speaking is an opportunity for you to share who you are, but to also, in the context of you and coming up with this particular time in your life as residents, you're going to be presenting specific research. So part of what we're going to talk about today is audience and that. But I want to start off with this, and this is a question to all of you. Why do some presentations stink? Anyone? Why do some of them stink?
People read from the slides.
People read from the slides. Excellent. What else?
Because they're relevant to the speaker, not necessarily the audience.
Relevant to the speaker, not necessarily on. So very self-motivated, but not thinking about who they're speaking to. Excellent. Why else do presentations stink?
Inadequate flow with a lot of ums and ahs.
A lot of filler. Excellent.
Too long.
Too long.
Boring.
Boring. Come on, you guys. This is great.
Not enough pictures.
Not enough pictures. Anything else?
Monotonous.
Monotonous. Yes. The death by PowerPoint. How many people in this room have actually been trained on PowerPoint? Has anyone actually sat down? So you actually got a training on PowerPoint. One hand out of the room. Okay. This is not every presentation needs to have a PowerPoint by any means, or even a slide deck, and that's something we can talk about. But the fact of the matter is that many of us are asked to give presentation after presentation, but we're not actually trained in the tools that we use often for these presentations. There's a reason that bullets on PowerPoints have become the death of all of us, and it's because it's the default mechanism on the PowerPoint. You open it up, it's the first thing that you see, and you start typing in, right? No. Banish the bullets. When you think about what makes a presentation good, as opposed to this, what other thing, what different things come to mind? What makes a strong presentation?
Audience interaction.
Audience interaction, absolutely. And this is true of whether you're doing a presentation or a toast or a class. You as an audience member want to feel like you are part of the process. That someone is here to engage with you. It's not just a one-directional conversation. That's not a conversation. It's not just a one-directional presentation. It's actually a conversation with individuals. Conjure I mentioned here, and this is something that I want to frame our talk with. He has 4 characteristics that he thinks every person should be mindful of when thinking about persuasive communication. And I want to frame our talk around these 4. He says persuasion involves careful preparation, the proper framing of arguments, the presentation of vivid supporting evidence, and the effort to find the correct emotional match with your audience. So let's take these one by one. First thing Conjure says is you have to establish credibility. For you guys, as orthopedic residents, what does credibility look like for you? What does credibility mean in your world? How do you establish it with your 8 minutes in front of our friend from the University of Pennsylvania?
Organized, composed.
Organized, but also, who are you, first of all?
Well, residents.
You're all residents, you're all here. I mean, this is part of credibility within the field of medical professions. But you're right, there's what you have after your name, but there's also, as you say, the approach that you bring to your talk. Is it something that's well thought out? Credibility is not just what you can demonstrate on paper or in titles, but it's also, as you say, how you form your argument, how you put it forward. Excellent. What else does that make sense about credibility? What it looks like? Now, does credibility alone mean that you're going to have a strong presentation? No. In fact, riding on credibility at the expense of preparation is always, well, is a recipe for unhappiness, let's just say. I know that in giving these talks in my global health work, I've worked quite a bit overseas, and it's an interesting conversation to have around rank and title and status, and then how that then translates to presenting in front of groups, and what you can expect in terms of an audience seeing your rank and then how they will respond to you. Now, in the context of the presentations you're going to be giving, what is it, in the next month? In the next month, there is the situation where you all would not be here if you were not immensely talented. And you have that going into that presentation. But you also know that you have, 7 or 8 minutes, so not quite as long as a TED Talk, but 7 or 8 minutes is plenty of time to make an impression. And yet you're going to get Q&A afterward. So you need to think about how you define credibility in the context of this presentation. What does it look like to you? Is it not only who you are and your background, but is it also, I'm sorry, what's your name, sir?
Myth.
What Myth suggested, it's about also, would you say, your demeanor. Does that make sense? Is that fair to say? How you present, how you physically stand, how you think about the use of the space. Are you behind a podium? Are you using notes? Are you using a slide deck? Do you need a visual reminder or a visual enhancer to the way that you speak? And thinking, as we'll talk about, how do you use visuals to enhance what you are saying to the audience? So the first thing Conjure says is you've got to establish that credibility. And I'm putting forward that credibility comes from not only your status, but also, as Myth said, the way that you comport yourself, how you appear in front of the group. Second thing that Conjure says is you need to frame common ground. Persuasive communication in the form of a presentation has to do with the connection between audience and speaker, and to the extent that that speaker is able to say to this audience, in their way, with their language, that you and I have something that we can meet on. In the context of your research, it could be that you are speaking to an audience of professionals in your field. You know you're not speaking to my peers at the comm department. We would need a lot more information from all of you about orthopedic surgery. We would have no idea where to start. You would have to take us to a new position. Your research would need all kinds of qualifying information and contextual information that me and my colleagues would need in a way that the audience you will face in the next month doesn't necessarily need that same context. And that's important to think about that audience. But you still have to frame that common ground. It's deeply important because assuming that in that audience, there are people who need, especially in the context of research, which you will be presenting, regardless of their background in the field, they want to be told, they want to be shown by you, illuminated by you, how this research enhances their understanding of the field. And in the case of all of you, you're talking to somebody who has years and years of experience in that field. So your challenge is to make this research new, to make this research exciting, and to make this research accessible to the person you're speaking with. So I would say that this common ground in the context of your presentations should look at how can you present that information in a way that is dynamic, but also piques the curiosity and the interest of someone who has an existing body of information and knowledge in that field. It's one thing to talk to an audience that's brand new, that doesn't have that professional context. It's another thing to engage and inspire an audience where that professional context is very well known. Does that make sense? Second thing that Conjure talks about is providing evidence. Third thing that Conjure discusses in persuasive communication is the idea of providing evidence. And this is where the conversation can go a number of different directions depending on the population in question. When you think about your research, and you think about the time you're going to have in front of this panel and presenting it, what might evidence look like for each of you? Just some examples. If you're thinking about how you're going to incorporate evidence around your research, what might it look like in the context of your presentations? How are you going to present that evidence? What's it going to look like in the context of the presentation?
Charts or diagrams.
Charts or diagrams. And talk to me a little bit. What's your name?
Kenny.
Kenny? Charts and diagrams. Talk a little bit about using charts and diagrams and how do they persuade and how are they effective or not?
That if they can be concise enough
Mhm.
and can help clearly show a difference or a finding
Mhm.
and be clear, then they can be helpful. But
Mhm.
sometimes if they're too cluttered
Yeah.
or there's too many words associated with it or there's too much information going on, then they can be distracting.
Right. So the goal is to make them as concise, as clear as possible, so that they tell the truth about your data, correct? You also want to make sure that the charts and the graphs reflect accurately that which you have gleaned from your calculations. But I also think that this goes back to one of the points made earlier about not enough pictures. That I think in the context of presentations, and this is especially true in the academy, I've found, that there is an abundance of words that tend to go up on screens at the expense often of images, whether it's images that reflect actual data or images that just impart some information about the presentation that you're giving. I think often we have we are mistaken in thinking that too many slides or more slides equals a presentation that will probably be poor. I've had situations where people have seen a slide deck that is 95 slides and they've assumed that this is going to be an interminable presentation that just goes on and puts everyone to sleep, but it's actually a much more effective presentation than one that's only 15 slides long because it's very open space. There's just one or two images per slide, and it's meant to take the audience through the slide deck in a way that's quick, that's sparky, and that encourages conversation. So getting back to what Kenny said, when you think about images, and I'm going to give you guys some links to some data visualization sites that I've had students at various levels of their careers use very effectively, that to the extent that images and graphs and charts can propel forward your observations, but do it in a way that you say, Kenny, that's concise, that's illuminating, but that isn't distracting. Keep in mind when you're doing that presentation, depending on how large the room is, depending on how much time you have, but also specifically depending on the distance that you sit and your slides sit, if you use slides from the audience, something that can look fantastic on your laptop when you're a foot away from it can be a disaster if someone's 200 feet away from it at the far end of an auditorium. So always be in mind, keeping that in mind in terms of your font size, in terms of the design of the slide deck or the Prezi, or if you choose not to use slides, how you think about crafting your talk in a way that is illuminating but does not challenge the audience to understand or to read what you've written. When I was first putting this deck together, and the version of a talk that I gave that Amy saw, there were some data visualization slides that I realized just didn't work for the presentation because you could not see the data on them. They were more intended to be read in a written or a printed tactile environment. They weren't meant for being put up on a screen. You would see it a long distance. Here's a question for all of you, because I just don't know. Would it be expected that each of you would use visuals along with your presentation? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it would look almost odd if you didn't. Yeah. And this is often the reality. This is not unique to you. But for that reason, I would say especially that you want to think about how you use that slide deck, because just because slides are expected doesn't mean that they need to look a kind of real particular way. And thinking about the slide deck beyond just the crutch of a teleprompter, which it has become for so many people, but also thinking about it more expansively as enhancing what you were saying, not creating competition between what you were saying and what the slide deck is saying. Asking that audience to both listen to you and read a slide deck at the same time is challenging. I make one exception for this when I think about words and when I think about slide decks. And this may be something you guys encounter if you do work internationally, which is that as I have traveled and worked in environments where English isn't a first language, I changed my slide decks completely. They no longer reflect the kind of audience that I typically encounter at the University of Washington. And I adjust them because I also know that these slide decks, in many cases, when I'm speaking to my colleagues in Ethiopia, or if I'm in southern Sudan, they're going to need more help in terms of grasping what I'm saying, so my slide decks change. And I say this to all of you because I don't mean to suggest in my presentation today that there is one way to give awesome presentations. A big part of giving awesome presentations is knowing your audience and knowing how that audience is going to react to how you present information, and thinking about how the slide deck, or whatever you use that's visual, if you do use a visual, and in the case of presenting your research, you should, it sounds like, you want to make sure that there is an intentionality between you, your information, and then the audience that you seek to reach. Any questions so far? Is this making sense? Good. The final slide, or the final thing that Jay Condra puts forward in persuasive communication is the idea of connecting emotionally. And in the time that I've taught and worked with colleagues across the University of Washington, this is one of the trickiest, I'd say it's probably the trickiest of the four, especially when you're talking about presenting academic research. Emotional connection and academic research are somewhat strange bedfellows. They don't always go together. You don't think of academic research as necessarily having a particularly strong emotional hook. And so I would put forward today that when you think about your precious 7 to 8 or 9 minutes that you have to present research, one of the concepts that has worked well and that I've spent a fair amount of time teaching on and working particularly overseas with my global health colleagues is the idea of story as a way of bridging the research and the emotional connection. And when I say story, this could be a story that you tell and share personally in a way that you present yourself as someone who is not only giving the talk, but is becoming a person, a member, and a contributor in this field of scholarship. So how do you place yourself in the talk? And this is somewhat controversial. I know that there are pockets of the academy where the I pronoun, the experience that an individual brings to research is not always seen as one that should be so cozy. But my argument is that even in a short presentation, there is space for you to create those moments of connection with the audience. And I think that's actually quite crucial to create those moments of connection, because that is what people are going to remember. It should not distract. They should absolutely propel the thinking and your presentation forward. But I would think creatively about how to create that emotional connection, whether it's through story, whether it's through how you present, and your own choices around the presentation, but there are a number of ways that you could think about what does that emotional connection look like. And what I like to try to do is take myself out of a particular presentation and go back in my mind to talks that I've heard where I have left the talk and 5 hours later, 5 days later, 5 weeks later, I can still remember elements of that presentation. To me, that's a successful conversation that's been created between the presenter and the audience. And research that you are creating here when it comes to the field, this is about the future of the field. This is about the future of your career. And so thinking about how to imbue your talk with these higher levels of the conversation that are not overly dramatic. I'm not intending for you guys to come out here and offer up Oscar-winning performances where there are tears at the end. But I do think that any topic is worthy of strong investigation into that emotional connection for people. And it shouldn't be something that's shied away from simply because it's a more formal talk or because it's a talk where there's a power imbalance between the audience and the presenters. I still think that emotional connection is vital. It's just a matter of tweaking it and thinking about how you want it to unfold within the context of the talk. Does that make sense? Good. So, looking at Conjures 4, let's go back. You want to establish your credibility, which is a combination of not only your chops and what you've been working so hard on the last 5 years, and also before that, of course, but also how you present. Are you meant to be there? That sense of, we talk about owning the stage, or we talk about thinking about delivery, and are you using notes? Are you winging off the notes? Have you done the work? Have you put in the time so that when you hit that stage, it's as if you were meant to be there? That idea of framing common ground. This gets to the idea of the audience, knowing your audience. There's no way you're going to be able to frame that common ground if you haven't thought deeply about who's in the chairs in front of you. And then the idea of providing evidence, and this evidence can come in the form of testimonials, it can come in the form, as we've said, of visuals, and we'll talk about that in a second, a little bit more, but the idea that there needs to be some real moments of not just clarity, but compelling information within that short time frame you have. And that idea of how do you then connect emotionally? How do you leave the audience with a strong and indelible memory of who you are, and what you've said, and what the research reveals? So, on to how this happens. I took a course once with Michael Shadow, who is a communication professional who works specifically with politicians. And he told a story in terms of practice that I had never heard, which is back in one of the presidential elections, let me see if I can get this right, it was when Lloyd Bentsen was the vice presidential candidate, so that's going to put it at about, when was that? 80s sometime? It was when Dan Quayle was running as the VP candidate with Bush Sr. And there was a very famous vice presidential debate. It was seen as the elder statesman Lloyd Bentsen up against the young, somewhat precocious Dan Quayle. And does anyone remember this?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, Peter Cameron's raising his hand. And it had the famous moment where Dan Quayle made a reference to JFK. And Lloyd Bentsen came sweeping in, perfect amount of time. It was delivered with that, let's see if I can remember it. It was something like, you mentioned John Kennedy. John Kennedy I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. You're no Jack Kennedy. It was just the moment that, if we'd had Twitter at that moment, it would have absolutely erupted. It was when the vice presidential debate was over. It was absolutely over. Now, I remember being a young little puppy and watching this and thinking that Bentsen was an absolute genius. And here's someone who had capitalized in the moment and had offered something so crippling. I mean, it was just the final blow. It was as if they were in the ring and there had been a knockout. Quayle was done at that point. Well, Michael Shadow, 20 years later, I'm in a workshop with him, and he talks about how many hours they practiced that line. They knew there was a great chance that Quayle was going to reference JFK. They absolutely knew it. Lloyd Bentsen had said that line hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. But it was able to come off in the context of that moment as if he had just taken advantage of a gap on the part of his competitor. So this is obviously a high stakes example that I'm using, but I put it forward to all my students that the more you put in the time the better chance you have to come off as spontaneous, to come off as comfortable, to come off as fluid. What's your name, sir? Paul talked about the fillers and the fact that we often judge speakers by what is the fluidity of their speech? To what extent can they take us along like a river, as opposed to somebody like your great aunt who's driving in the car and is braking and stopping and putting in the fillers. Practice is part of that. And this is challenging, of course, because time is precious to all of us, and practice is something that asks us to get up in front of others, looking for that feedback. Not only does it take time, but it takes a certain amount of courage, because I think that being brave enough to put out your notes, to put out your drafts, to see them as drafts. I once made the mistake of telling my editor that every word I wrote was perfect. I don't know what I was thinking. And she looked at me and she said, "You are crazy. You are just crazy. You have just started a draft. This is the first blush. It's going to get better and better and better." What I meant is that I was so attached to this particular piece that I had written. I thought that it just was, I didn't want to change a thing. And she's like, "No, you can't think of it that way. You've got to give it to different eyes. You have to have different people look at it. You have to have people unpack it, build it back up, take it up again." I cannot stress the importance of putting in the time in advance of, for a 7 or 8 minute talk, we're talking about hours and hours and hours, whether it's working on the deck, thinking about your delivery, nailing your intro, how are you going to deal with Q&A. All of this has to do with the investment that we make in what can be a very short amount of time, but it's the difference between being able to leave that audience dazzled and feeling as if you've really capitalized on the moment and propelled yourself forward as a future contributor to the field. I've already talked a little bit about stories, but I just want to swoop back around it once more, because I do think it's important to talk about the idea that stories reflect values. And when you go up in front of the panel and you think about how you want to present the research, this research can be seen as very clinical. It can be seen as you have collected information and data, it presents information, and there's a level of detachment that can come sometimes from data. And I've seen this in some of my work down in global health. But I would argue that the stories that we tell around data, the stories that we tell, what does the data say, what does the research indicate, the stories have a way of elevating data to those larger core values about why we all do the work that we do. You are all working in a field that's attached to some of the most, I would say, lofty, and I mean this in the best sense of the word, values that exist in the world. You are here to help. You are here to heal. You are here to provide opportunities for people to reach their highest potential, especially those who are in a position where they are compromised. So take advantage of the fact that you all exist and are engaged in a field that has tremendous value when you think about what are the higher values that motivate all of you. Why did you decide to go to medical school? Why do you want to engage in this particular subfield within medicine? What is it about? What is it about the field? What is it about you? What is it about your story that propels you forward, that makes you excited? How do stories then allow those values to nestle in with the very clear and I would say also the informative, the illuminative nature of data? How do you find room for both of those things in two of your hands? The values that drive you and the data that supports the research that you're presenting. So thinking about stories in that way, very important. And this gets back to what Kenny said. The purpose of visualization is insight, not just pictures. You don't want to just put up something because it's pretty or because it's a wow factor. Those are wonderful things as side benefits, but ultimately you want the data to tell the truth, and you want the data to illuminate. I think, Peter, you're going to send this out so that they'll have all access to this. You don't have to write this down, but these are 4 sites that students of mine have found very, very useful when it comes to data visualization. Easy data visualization sites where you can drop in raw numbers and then really play around with what you want the infographics to look like. We're lucky right now to have this kind. Next thing I want to talk about, or the next link that I want to say, and I just put it up here because I knew you guys could then go to it. Has anyone seen the movie An Inconvenient Truth? I actually never have, but for those of you who saw it, I've heard that the visuals were quite stunning in that. They were all done by a firm down in California called Nancy Duarte Design, and she is considered a real pioneer when it comes to taking a traditional slide deck and really elevating it to an art form. And she has 2 books out. One is called Slideology and one is called Resonate. And when I was based at the Department of Global Health, she gave us a long distance lecture called Pimp My Slides. It's 45 minutes long. This hyperlink will take you right to it. It's the best 45 minutes you could possibly spend when it comes specifically to how to take a slide deck and transform it.
It's 9 hours.
It's 9 hours. So I can't recommend enough. If slide decks are the way that you're going to go for your presentation, if you're not going to do Prezi, if you're not going to do, if there's any kind of slide deck you've got going, I guarantee you will take something away from Nancy Duarte's 45 minutes. It'll be a good bookend to what I've presented here today, because what she does is she really starts to get down to the nitty-gritty of PowerPoint specifically. And she has 5 recommendations that she lays out very clearly. One of them includes data, a number of them include balance, and some of the things that I've mentioned, like the number of slides does not translate to how strong your presentation is going to be. Short presentations aren't necessarily better than long presentations. Very sound advice from someone who is considered a leader in the field. So I cannot recommend that link highly enough, especially when it comes to talks like you're looking at, where you have a limited amount of time to convey some pretty complicated information. And so that's also something that you want to be very mindful of when you're putting together your slide decks, is that you have a limited amount of time, but that doesn't mean that you should be limited to a certain number of slides. Don't let anybody look at your slide deck and say, that's too many slides. You've done the work, you've put in the time. I once had a student give a 50-minute presentation. He had 190 slides, and it was fine. It was absolutely fine. Number of slides has nothing to do with length of talk. Banish that from your mind. Your slide deck should be as long as it needs to be. So in closing, going back to the megaphone, thinking about not just that it's a noisy age and that you have that 7 or 8 minutes, but the fact that you shouldn't have to shout. That's my parting idea for all of you, is that a strong presentation is one where you don't need the megaphone. The megaphone is something that calls out for attention. You're trying to grab people's attention. It's done over great distances. And I think that when you put together, you take Conjur's advice to heart, you think about communication in those 4, take a look at Nancy Duarte's slideshow, you think about the time you're going to put into this presentation, you don't need the megaphone. All you need is the clarity of your words, the conviction of what your research stands for, and at the same time, you need to understand that this is, to use the 3rd C, a conversation. It's a conversation, and especially given the fact you're going to have Q&A afterward. Don't think of it as one-directional. Think of it as an opportunity to build relationships in that room, especially given that this is your field, and these are your future colleagues, not only in this room, but certainly in the context of presenting that research with your mentors, with the guest coming out from University of Pennsylvania. So if we think of public speaking and presentation as a conversation and not just a presentation, I think it changes our attitude about it. Sitting down at a cafe may not feel the same as getting up in front of your peers or people even beyond you in the field, but if you think of it in that context as having a conversation that doesn't end when your presentation does. It's meant to be an invitation, 7 or 8 minutes, to present information, but that greases the wheels for you to continue to have that conversation well beyond when those 7 or 8 minutes close. So I thank you for your time. I wish you all the best. I have my email here at the end if you have any follow-up questions, but I really appreciate Amy and Peter for inviting me, and thank you for all of you for your attention. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. Are there some questions that you'd like to pose?
Yes, I've got some time. Anything? Yes.
Other than PowerPoint, what have you seen people use? I mean, you can go back to the normal overhead projector that we all probably saw in
Bring out the
grade
Sharpie.
school.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Like, what are people using?
I experimented with Prezi for a little bit. Are people familiar with Prezi? Have you used it? Prezi allows you to build your entire deck on one canvas. If you can imagine, instead of having sequential slides that unfold, it has an element of movement to it.
It moves the focus.
It moves the focus, and you drill in and you come back out. And I've found that with my colleagues, people tend to have a preference. They like the linear slide deck, or they really enjoy the somewhat creative efforts that go into building a presentation off of a single canvas in Prezi. My word to the wise with Prezi is that sometimes you have to hand out Dramamine to your audience if you do not think carefully. Again, that has to do with the practice, because it is flying all over the screen. And so I've seen some first attempts at Prezi that really feel like you're on a ship, because you're coming in, you're going out, you're going over. So that's an element that you want to be very mindful of when you use Prezi. I think it has wonderful. To me, they're just different. It depends on what you want to convey, but it's a pretty intuitive. Who's used it? You said, did you find it somewhat intuitive? I found that it was.
If you're using it for the first time, it probably like triples the amount of time it takes to make
Yes.
the actual presentation.
Yes. There's always going to be that learning curve, so you want to spend some time on it before you put it up in front of other people. But, yeah, so Prezi is one of those. I saw a very effective presentation where the speaker took their iPad and just pulled up photos from their photo stream. They connected the iPad to the overhead, and he spoke and just pulled up photos on his iPad. It was wonderful. It was really well done. Again, you got to know your talk if you're going to do that. And I recognize, and you guys will know this, not I, but in some corners of the academy, there is an absolute expectation that you will read your notes. In fact, if you didn't, it would be seen as suspect. But I think there is now a growing tolerance, perhaps is not exactly the right word, but for not necessarily being wedded to the written word, but actually speaking extemporaneously. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out for your presentations, but that's something that you need to know, again, in the context of your professional environment. Am I expected to read my talk? Will it be acceptable if I don't? If I speak off the slides but not actually deliver a written talk? That's something you need to think about, and I think that also then impacts the kind of visuals that accompany it. But as I said, that iPad was a very effective one because it was just images as it went. Prezi, PowerPoint, SlideShare. I mean, SlideShare is more a way to share that, but I've also seen folks that have basically created a slideshow. They haven't used their iPad, but they've just put up 7 or 8 photographs that accompany each of their thoughts and move that through. And that's worked well.
We should let you go. Thanks so much for
Yes.
your